It's time 11:03. Hope everybody's doing okay. And before I get into the content of the lecture today, I want to talk a little bit about some modifications that have to do with, or that result from the impact, consequences, I guess, of the events of the last 2 weeks, I guess, last week, this week as well. So I want to make sure that everybody's paying attention. I will probably send a subsequent email, so those who are not the class for whatever reason don't end up joining the class can be aware of these. So the first thing that I should say, in case this hasn't been clear, maybe it's clear from the syllabus, I actually have not checked back with my own syllabus, is that for the final exam for this class is not cumulative, okay? So it's only from, say, week 6 till the end, okay? So we're not, for the exam, we're not doing the entire, the content of the entire course, let's say, right? So that's the first thing, in case you didn't know. This is the practice of my classes. And the other thing that I wanted to mention is that has to do with the readings, I guess. Let me just go to share the syllabus. I think I have it here. So let me do back. Screen. Global Mexico. Okay, so everybody can see that? Yes, good, thank you. I'm relying here on a little bit on Andrew for these. So last week and this week we're supposed to. I mean, we have been with all the disruptions and everything, discussing sort of economic globalization and the impact of economic globalization in Mexico, particularly in the context of the transition from import substitution industrialization to export-oriented industrialization. Remember, that's what ISI and EOI mean. And so, of course, given the fact that we didn't have a proper class on Thursday, and we had the exam and everything, we're doing a little bit of an abridged version of the material. So I ask you for today to read these piece. I have asked you to read just a couple of pages on the Washington Consensus, which is basically the sort of neoliberal structural adjustment recipes that the IMF recommended, or perhaps not recommended, imposed, it might be a better word, on Latin American economies and Latin American governments, right? That's just a couple of pages. So I hope you read that. It's very easy to read because one of the economists that is associated with so-called Washington consensus, in fact, has written a few pieces about the kind of short history of the Washington Consensus and how that came about. But what is interesting about those couple of pages, perhaps more than the actual sort of history of the Washington Consensus, is what exactly were the things that were sort of recommended or asked to do as that were sort of imposed on the Latin American governments and economies in exchange for loans that stabilized their economies, right? Back in the 80s. We talked about the 80s as the lost decade of Latin American economies. It also impacted other economies, developing world. I sent a message, an email to all of you, asking you to read this piece, the Slonimsky Christian. I always have trouble pronouncing his last name. Christian Slonimsky, who is an anthropologist who wrote this book, Made in Baja, The Lives of Farm Workers and Growers Behind Mexico's Transnational Agricultural Boom. That should be in italics, the title. And so, yeah, this piece will be included in the final. Okay, so it'll be part of the final. So, and that's, and from there, let's say we're going to be, I guess, moving forward, right? From that and from what we're discussing today. So, but in order to kind of like regain our sort of train of thought, or of our train of our thread in terms of the kinds of things that we're discussing, I'm going to go back a little bit to some of the issues that we had that we were talking about. Now, for next week is already week 7, and we are discussing populism in Mexico and Latin America right here, right? And so these readings, right, I'm going to upload them this afternoon, okay? And they're an important part of our course because we are, or Mexico actually, going to have elections, right? Presidential elections in just a few weeks. And also because the current government is actually a government that has, at least politically, socially departed from the sort of neoliberal Washington consensus, right, of the 1980s. But it's a very interesting situation because while politically and socially the current government represents a departure, the current leader or the current president of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, is identified with, populist style of leadership or government. The economy has actually not changed, of course. The economy continues to be an economy that is, has been sort of driven in terms of its growth by its orientation towards, export production, right? Manufacturing, but export in general. And also the export orientation, in fact, has been even bolstered, I would say, by something that people call relocalization. Anybody has heard about that term or that word? Please express yourselves, yes or no. Anybody knows what relocalization is? No. Good. Just say no if you haven't heard about that. Natalia said yes. What's relocalization, Natalia?
It's when companies are going back to their main, country where they used to do operations before.
Almost. almost not. It could be that, but in our case, in the case of Mexico, relocalization means or has meant that I'll give you the floor in a second, okay? A relocalization has meant the move of companies and capital from China to Mexico, right? Because of the growing antagonism and geopolitical driven conflict between the U.S. and China, more companies, including actually Chinese companies, not just U.S. capital, let's say, but even Chinese companies, companies from all over the world actually, who were producing in China with the idea of exporting to the United States, are actually relocating to Mexico, right? And there is a significant boom in terms of foreign direct investment, capital moving from China, particularly, to Mexico, and to, with the idea first of avoiding the geopolitical conflict, right? As the U.S. puts more and more restrictions on Chinese goods, right? Goods made in China. Actually, just yesterday, there were a series of statements. Relocalization, nearshoring is the same. You're absolutely right, Natalia. Yeah, relocalization, nearshoring, they're the two terms. Actually, to be fair, I think in English, nearshoring is a more common term. In Spanish and other Romance languages, relocalization is probably, relocalización is the word that is used in Spanish. But there might be some movement towards Canada. I'm not that aware of that. The one thing, Mark, is that Canadian labor is more expensive than Mexican labor, right? So if companies move from China to Canada, and they are labor intensive in terms of their processes, their production processes, they face significant higher costs. Not the case with Mexico, where labor is cheaper, environmental regulations are less stringent, let's say, as well. And so really the move is to Mexico, right? I was saying, so these companies are trying to avoid these restrictions, right, imposed by the U.S. Yesterday, there were some statements made by, if I remember correctly, by President Biden about restricting Chinese-made or electric cars from entering the U.S. market, right? And this actually has a very interesting connection that I will talk about in just a second. But the other thing that these companies are trying to do is, of course, take advantage of the fact that Mexico has a free trade agreement with the U.S. and Canada, right? So that's why they're not moving to other places, right? Because of the free trade agreement that Mexico has with its North American partners. So that's actually something that is happening very, very powerfully. Enya, did you have a question? I saw your hand raised and
no, I was just gonna talk about what you just said, because I remember that in the second lecture you spoke about the Chinese companies moving to Mexico and also having to partner up with them. I think that you said that was part of the deal sometimes.
That was part of the what?
Companies. That the Chinese companies that would move to Mexico or relocalize would also partner up with local companies.
You might be you might be confusing the kind of. No, I think you might be confusing an important sort of regulation that existed under ISI. Under ISI, foreign companies moving to Mexico had to partner with domestic capital, Mexican capital, let's say. But now that kind of regulation and everybody else is gone, right? Because the Constitution and the rules for foreign direct investment in Mexico under the kind of like neoliberal consensus, the Washington consensus, have changed, and now these companies don't need a local partner. The Mexican law does not mandate a local partner. Does that help, Anya?
Yes, thank you.
Of course. Anyway, so if there are no questions, because I tend to go off on tangents, I will go and share my screen. Let's see where. Okay, so in one sec here. Okay, so I just a kind of sort of warning. It's a minor thing because you guys already saw these and know these, but again, as I said, kind of regain our train of thought, our thread in terms of the discussion. I'm going to go back to some of the things that I spoke about last week, early last week, and to connect it to a little bit to the chapter I asked you to read from the book Made in Baja. Right, so it's actually if you haven't had the chance or you just started, please make sure you read it because it's very important. It has a lot of good stuff that we'll continue to talk about when we talk about not just the economy, but also when we talk about environmental issues, extractivism, all these other things that are coming down the line. Okay, so last week I already started talking about these impacts, right, of export-oriented industrialization. This move signified a very powerful restructuring, and that we will see some data, I guess, in a moment. Very powerful restructuring of the Mexican economy. That opening of the Mexican economy, that liberalization, right, displaced local producers and increased immigration. I will not talk a lot about migration now because we also have some time down the line dedicated for this topic. I mentioned also how this move to export-oriented industrialization in Mexico impacted or deepened regional economic inequality in Mexico because a lot of the investment were made initially, and probably the bulk of the investment continues to be made in sort of north of Mexico City, let's say, right? Northern Mexico, north central northern Mexico, right? A lot of manufacturing plants, et cetera. And now there's a little bit more going to the south, but it's still lagging significantly. And of course, over the past almost 40 years, between 30 to 40 years, 35 years, there's been a massive move of foreign, capital to take advantage of, low-cost labor. We talked about NAFTA, proximity to the U.S., weak environmental regulations, et cetera. So I'll go into more detail about this issue of the transnational labor regime, right? How now what we have in place essentially is Mexican labor being used for export, for manufacturing, and how, of course, that has, in a way, sort of required a kind of disciplining of labor, right? Limiting at various points the rights of workers to strike, controlling or curbing wage increases, so the cost of labor sort of remains competitive, and appeals to capital, and so on. So we'll use the case of agriculture in a moment, but let's talk a little bit more about the impact of the move to EOI, to export-oriented industrialization. Right, there's been a profound transformation of Mexico's economic base. And, these data that I'm showing you here, it comes from 2022. And, I think even a year and a half probably makes a significant difference. But what does this transformation signifies, or what are the impacts or consequences of this transformation in Mexico's economic base? Well, Mexico has become a powerhouse in the export of manufactured goods. One of the most sort of iconic or more representative, I guess I should say, indicators of this transformation is the fact that Mexico has become a very important manufacturer of cars, and is now the seventh largest producer. So it sort of, I don't think it has moved higher on the list, but it's there between the seventh and eighth place in terms of car manufacturing, right? In 2022, 3 million cars were produced, of which 90% were exported, and 76% were exported to the U.S. That means, some of that ends up in Canada. Some of that, there's an old sort of export stream to Central America. But it's actually very, very, very interesting. In the last few years, not just U.S., say, or European or Japanese car manufacturing companies have moved more facilities to Mexico, but now, and this is where the connection with China is very interesting. Now, Chinese companies are moving to Mexico, and I've made this comment in class, I think, before. They are actually coming in very strongly in Mexico. One, they are setting up plants in Mexico, but they're also importing manufactured cars, already produced cars, into the Mexican market. And they are about to also establish production plants to produce electric vehicles, which is a very interesting challenge in the kind of, or issue in the geopolitical context, in the larger geopolitical context, because they will be, cheaper, significantly cheaper than U.S. or Japanese or even Korean made cars. I'm talking about specifically about electric vehicles. And some of these Chinese companies, of course, are interested in exporting these vehicles to the U.S. Market, right? Much to the unhappiness of the U.S. government, right? Which is in the process of actually, as I just said, and as it was stated by the president yesterday, the U.S. government is in the process of establishing new barriers to those cars. So much for free trade, and so much for free trade, and so much for environmental concerns, right? It's a very interesting contradiction, right? How these intend to and discourse and narrative about free trade and all sorts of multilateral institutions dedicated to promote free trade, and then curbing emissions and so on, run against the reality of geopolitics, or the realities of geopolitics. Okay. Yes, Isa, or Isa. I always get your name wrong, Isa. You say Isa, right?
Yeah, Isaiah.
Isaiah. Oh my God. Neither. Sorry about that. So Isaiah, I have to practice that. I read that tariffs are 20 or 25% because the Chinese cars are about $20,000 cheaper. That's a huge difference, right? I mean, that's very, very significant. It's a huge difference. Anyway, I was recently in Mexico, right? And in my hometown of Monterrey, Mexico, which is an industrial powerhouse and the second largest city in Mexico, there are lots and lots of dealers now selling Chinese cars. So anyway, it's super interesting. Now, the whole, while cars are very iconic in many ways, right? They're sort of almost like an emblem of, manufacturing industry for the past 100 years. Mexico is also producing machinery, electronics, auto parts, pharmaceutical and medical equipment, chemicals, all sorts of things, right? So the range of manufactured goods it's very significant, as you know. The other thing that might come as a surprise or not is that also Mexico has grown tremendously its export agricultural sector, right? Services as well, but the chapter that I asked you to read comes from as I said, a book called Made in Baja, which actually deals with the rise of these agricultural or export agricultural sector, actually not very far from us, right? Just in Baja California, just a few hours driving from Los Angeles. The other thing that is actually very important and very interesting in multiple ways, more than one way, is the fact that while towards the end of the period of import substitution industrialization, and even after that, in the early years of export-oriented industrialization, oil exports played a very important role in the economy. It's no longer the case, right? There are several reasons for that. Now, the last bullet point there, or the last point on that slide, states oil exports are still important for government finances, but we have to differentiate between government finances and the larger economy, right? Oil extraction and processing are a monopoly of the state in Mexico. If you probably remember, we talked about that in class. The selling of gasoline, of fuel, has been liberalized the past few years. So for a long time, if you drove through Mexico, Mexican roads and highways, you would see that that there was just one brand of gasoline, right? One kind of gas station, Pemex, which is the government company that has the monopoly on extraction, commercialization. But now Pemex also sells to private firms that actually on the sort of retail end of the process sell to consumers, right? So now if you're driving in Mexico, you go visit Mexico, you'll see that it's not just Pemex, but many other companies that have that are sort of in that market, right? But once again, in this process of transformation of the Mexican economy, oil exports are not as important for the larger economy. They continue to be important for government finances. Now, the other thing that is happening, and I don't know to what extent you, or at least some of you, might be paying attention to new economic news from Mexico, but actually the Mexican oil monopoly firm, right, Pemex, is actually in very deep trouble because it's actually very inefficient. And fact, loses a lot of money every day. And so actually Mexico has had to cut its production of oil very significantly in the last literally few weeks, months. And it also appears that these sort of oil fields that Mexico relied on, particularly in the southeastern part of Mexico, in the Gulf of Mexico, the southern part of the Gulf of Mexico, are not as productive. But there are also issues of efficiency or inefficiency. Okay, let me just So let me just show you this figure here, because it comes from one of the authors that is listed on the syllabus. I'm not going to ask you to read the article, but please do take notes from what I'm saying. This actually comes from the article, and the article is posted on Canvas, right? I believe under week 5. And actually, in this figure here, the author, last name Ruiz Duran, compares the two dates, right, in this sort of process of transformation of the Mexican economy. 1990, which is the kind of like darker bar, and 2016. Again, if we were to conduct this exercise for say 2022 or 2023, I think the differences would be even more dramatic. But they're quite dramatic here, because what you can see in the sort of 25 years, 25, 26, 27 years that he analyzes here, that he compares, it's a very substantial, very significant growth of the entire manufacturing apparatus in Mexico, much of which is dedicated or destined for export, for the export economy. Okay, so you have, for example, close to the top of that figure, you have you can see there 336 transportation equipment manufacturing. So this is the value of these exports, and you can see how the Mexico in 1990. Right, this is just when this sort of export-oriented economy is beginning to gather steam. Mexico didn't export that much, didn't manufacture that much transportation equipment, right? That's where the trucks and the cars and all these different things go in. And compare that to 1990, right? There is a very, very dramatic growth. Look at item 334, computer and electronic product manufacturing. Once again, very limited, more than a twofold growth from what I can see there in that figure. Chemical manufacturing, 325 towards the middle of that. And the other thing that I want to bring your attention to is actually food manufacturing, right? Because there's been also a very, very dramatic growth in manufacturing in Mexico. And this is in part what the chapter that I asked you to read sort of analyzes, right? The rise of the export economy. Okay, so before we go into the next slide, I wanted to kind of like give a moment to take this in and ask you if you have any questions. So let me well, I'm not going to stop sharing because then you cannot see this. But any questions? Isaiah, Natalia, Remitzi, Enya, anybody else? Andrew, anybody else?
There was a question from Olivia in the chat. I don't know, yes. Olivia, if you want to just ask it, I'm happy to read it out as well.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and read it. Sure. I was just wondering if the issues that you were talking about for Pemex would be more of like a modern example of the issues that happened with ISI.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. That's an excellent question, Olivia, because if we think about the heyday of ISI, the 1960s, the heyday of Mexico's oil production dependent economy, being the 1970s, yes. We have a sort of a different context in that especially those fields that were discovered in the southeastern part of Mexico, they were discovered in the second part of the 1970s, which means that those fields had tremendous potential, and that the oil that was there, has been, massively extracted over the past, half a century, right? Or almost going on a half a century. And so, there's an issue of the fact that whatever oil was there is gone, has been extracted and processed and sold and consumed, et cetera, et cetera. But then there are other issues that have to do with, and I'm not saying that this issue that I just described is unrelated to the issue of efficiency, but I don't have a more sort of nuanced analysis to connect the two. There is a very serious problem of efficiency in Pemex, right? Because of the use of outdated technology, probably a very large and costly workforce that does not match the reality of the oil industry today, right? Just to name a couple of things. I don't know if that kind of like goes in the direction of your question, Olivia, but please elaborate if it doesn't.
No, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Yeah, but it's a huge issue because and this is this little thread connects this week and what I'm saying now to next week, because the government of the previous president, not the current president, but the previous president, who was on board essentially with a kind of like, let's say, neoliberal. I'm using very hesitantly some of these terms because they tend to be thrown, around very easily, and I don't like to do that in my analysis, in my own work. But let's just say, the previous president, Enrique Peña Nieto, was basically on board with kind of like neoliberal agenda, economic terms, and he had led a reform of the Constitution early in his tenure to actually allow for private investment, private partnerships in Pemex, and not just in the sort of kind of like secondary market of the processing of oil, production of gas, of fuel, gasoline, but also in the actual extraction, right, of oil. A lot of these extraction now, again, because the fields have been depleted, the more sort of promising areas are in sort of deep water areas, right, in the Gulf of Mexico. Nothing in near the shore or in the sort of coastal areas, right, of the country, which means that to extract that oil, you require huge investment, a lot of high tech infrastructure, etc. So Enrique Peña Nieto led a reform of the Constitution to allow for private investment together with sort of government investment to Pemex, right? The following president, the president that is still in power, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, actually suspended that, and the problems for Pemex have only increased, over the past few years, and it's actually it's very serious in that, as I said already, the Pemex actually loses millions and millions of pesos every day, and it needs all sorts of direct and indirect subsidies from the government. But these days are mostly, let's say, indirect subsidies, and the prime example that I'm going to give you is that Pemex is supposed to pay taxes to the Mexican government, to the federal government. And so one way in which the government subsidizes Pemex is by not charging, not taxing it fully, to the extent that it should be taxed given its production, right? So it's, in other words, giving Pemex a break. But that break it's very costly to the entire country, costly to the entire population, right? Because we're talking about a huge enterprise, right? A huge company that has facilities all over the country, et cetera, right? So it's very, Mitzi, I saw you raise your hand. I'll give you the floor in just 1 second. But yeah, this is kind of the situation. Again, in that sense, Olivia, it kind of like it's brings us back, right, to the ISI moment, except for the fact that back in the 70s, those oil fields, especially in southeastern Mexico, they were sort of full, right? They were kind of like ripe for extraction. Not the case today, and that makes the situation tremendously sort of complicated. Yeah. Oh, Mitzi, go ahead.
Just to follow to what were you saying, the difference between, Enrique Peña Nieto is just like they pushed for privatization, but then Andrés Manuel didn't, what is this about? What is so strong, like no privatization of, rather than versus let's do privatization with the past governments? I mean, I don't.
That's a great question. No, that's a fundamental question, and part of the answer, partly because of time, but also in general because of content, Evemitsi and everybody else. Part of the answer lies in what I'm going to tell you today, and what we're reading about today, and what we're going to be discussing next week. Right? The current government, of course, it's a government that came into power, democratically elected, opposing the neoliberal agenda, right? And, that agenda, as you have read already, it has as one of its center points, right? Privatization of industries, right? Under the argument that, if you run companies, they'll be more efficient. When the government runs companies, it has to take into consideration all sorts of political things, political issues. Well, in the hands of the private sector, right? It's all about economic efficiency. I'm just a caveat here, just a footnote. Actually, I'm not saying that this is what I believe. This is what the kind of like neoliberal creed is, right? And so also part of the kind of anti-neoliberal agenda of the current president, López Obrador, makes or hammers on the fact that that at the same time that Mexico loses sovereignty when it puts critical industries in the hands of private actors. Say in the oil extraction, oil production is the perfect example of this, right? There's also a lot of corruption, right? And actually, the corruption, the anti-corruption flag, I guess, was a big part of the López Obrador's agenda, right? And kind of like the sort of basis, or one of the bases for his political legitimacy, right, is that, or has been, that he is the president that is fighting against the rampant corruption in the government, but also corruption between sort of the neoliberal governments and those private actors that were taking over critical industries in Mitzi, does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Anybody else on that, on those points? Okay, let's move forward. There are no other questions, but do ask questions, please. Sometimes I don't, I see, I don't pay attention, but I'm trying to focus on the content, right? Here I'm going to go. There's a lot of text here, but just take a picture or something like that. There we go. Okay, so because I'm going to just kind of skim through some of the points made by Ruiz Duran, which while he notes examines the very significant transformation of the economy under EOI, under export-oriented industrialization. He also makes the point that Mexico is kind of like in a kind of middle-income trap, right? Despite this fundamental transformation, despite this, kind of like globalization of the Mexican economy, right? He says, he argues, Mexico is really kind of stuck in the middle, right? It's not catching up. If you compare Mexico with Korea, for example, right? Korea went through a war in the 1950s, country divided, but the Korean economy has grown by very substantial leaps, and today, of course, Korea, in fact, doesn't have significant immigration, at least for economic reasons. Mexico still has a lot of migration, but also, besides that, it has a very significant significant percentage of its population living below the poverty line, right? So it has been reduced recently, but until very recently, still more than 40% of the Mexican population live or experience some kind of poverty. And this economist identifies a series of problems, including the fact that some of this export economy is growing in a kind of enclave way, meaning that in these sort of islands, right? And not producing the kind of linkages to the rest of the economy that you would expect or desire or want in order to generate more a wider impact. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. Take a picture of the screenshot or just use your phones, and I'll come back to this at some point anyway. We still have time for this, but I want to make sure that we move to the next thing. So the one thing that is, fascinating in many respects, and I want to make sure we have less than, we have what, about 20 minutes, right? 20 minutes. The other thing that has happened under EOI is, and the broader liberalization of the Mexican economy, is the development of a large export, agriculture sector, which is dominated by transnational corporations. And I'm actually always fascinated in living in Southern California. I don't know if you pay attention to these things, but I do look at where the products that I buy come from. And if you go to the fresh produce section of your supermarket, you will see that tons and tons of things, of course, are produced in the U.S. The U.S. has a huge agricultural sector, very, very powerful. But also, you will see that a lot of things actually come from Mexico. I was just thinking about, what? Tomatoes, cucumbers, lemons, and lime. Avocados, of course, right? Super Bowl, guacamole, variety of peppers, celery, broccoli, all sorts of berries, right? Strawberries continue to be, produced in Southern California, but a lot of it is also produced, particularly in the winter, in Mexico, right? Squash, different kinds of squash and zucchinis and all that stuff. Something that, some people call designer vegetables, and like these, tiny little, like tomatoes, right? Like grape tomatoes and tomato and that tomato, right? All these things that are grown in hothouses, right? And many other products, right? That come from Mexico. So the reading that I asked you to take a look at for today actually goes into how these export agriculture has been produced, right? So the author of the book is an anthropologist. He works at the University of Texas in Arlington, and writes export agriculture resembles a vertical global commodity chain with power concentrated in a handful of transnational companies that maintain a form of tutelage farming with a segment of subordinated local growers, right? So some of these companies that you find in your local supermarket, and he analyzes the case of Driscoll's, right, that produces berries, have over the past few years, decades at this point, like 20 plus years in some cases, move or open production in Mexico, right, and develop these export agricultural zones, particularly, but not exclusively, but particularly in northern Mexico. Why? Well, for some obvious reason and some not so obvious reason, right? One that is pretty obvious, I would say, is the proximity to the border. A lot of these berries and other products that are grown in these export agricultural zones in northern Mexico are produced for export to the United States. Some of them, I'm sure, make it all the way to Canada. There's also a population of settled farm workers. Some of these export agricultural zones are not entirely new. They've been there some way, but they used to use, or they used to be, they used to have a labor force that was composed by circular migrants, internal circular migrants. But over the years, some of these migrants have actually settled out of these streams, domestic streams. And so as a result of that, these export agricultural zones have a settled population of farm workers. And then there are, of course, climate and environmental characteristics that, some of these companies like. Oh, no. Okay. Oh. Okay. Okay. So our author, and we're probably not going to be exhausting all of that chapter today because it's actually longish for a chapter and very rich, I have to say, analyzes the case of Driscoll's, right? And again, I'm sure you've seen the brand of this company is in every supermarket, grocery store, wherever you go to find Driscoll's, right? Costco, you name it. And so it's actually a very interesting case study. According to our author, Driscoll's moved to this particular area in Baja California, the valley of San Quintin or San Quintin Valley, right? The Valle de San Quintin, Spanish, because it was increasingly difficult to operate in California in general and Southern California in particular because of the scarcity and the cost of land, right? California has become more and more populated over the decades. And, of course, there's been, after World War II, massive suburban growth. But that suburban growth actually has come at the cost of agricultural land. And on top of that, so making land more expensive, but also scarce, and also making production close to urban areas. And urban areas, are protected by all sorts of health and environmental regulations, which complicate agricultural production nearby. So this is not surprising given some of the things that we have discussed in this course. Companies like Driscoll's have gone to places like Baja, but Driscoll's also produces in other parts of Mexico, right? With a lot of production facilities in the northern part of the country. So as our author, analyzes, through a series of interviews, documented all sorts of things, Driscoll's, of course, as a very powerful U.S. company, has all sorts of, comparative advantages, right? First of all, it has a lot of money, right? Technology. It has invested in cooling and packaging plants, but it also has invested significantly in desalination plants, what he calls, brackish water, because, the Baja Peninsula is surrounded by water, right? Peninsulas are actually. A lot of the water that is extracted, a lot of the underground water extracted is brackish water, meaning that it has a high component of salt. Driscoll's it's not as salty as seawater, but it has a very significant, it's a mix, right, of water that includes a high saline component. And so water Driscoll has had the capacity to actually establish plans to eliminate the salt content. Of course, those processes, in addition to being expensive, they also produce a lot of waste. In some cases, wastewater, water that is contaminated with a lot of chemicals through this process. Of course, if you take the salt out of water and brackish water, and that refuse or waste, it's going to have a lot of high salt components. So Slolinsky, our author, makes the point that, of course, this is a huge issue because many of the homes in these agro-export valleys and all over northern Mexico, and for that matter, these days almost everywhere in Mexico, experience water scarcity for human consumption in the homes. But at the same time, these companies continue to be allowed to extract and pump underground water, right? Creating a very serious environmental and social problem in terms of access to this sort of vital resource, right? And when I say vital, of course, it's not just a figure of speech, right? We cannot live without water. So the other thing that is very interesting here is that part of this sort of process of setting shop in Baja entails or has entailed creating a sort of loyal and disciplined workforce. And this is something that I have started to study myself indirectly, and I plan to continue this more directly, and I will explain what I'm talking about here. But let me just first say that the workforce in Baja, the sort of agricultural workforce in the San Quintin Valley, in other parts, in other export agricultural valleys in northern Mexico, is actually composed by a significant percentage of indigenous Mexicans. Why? Because when these sort of valleys, agricultural valleys, got going decades ago, the companies used to recruit workers in southern Mexico, in states like Oaxaca, for example, right? State of Oaxaca in southern Mexico, and many of the workers who would come seasonally, who would be recruited seasonally to work, were actually indigenous, belonging to different ethnic groups. Now, as I said, many of them have settled out of these migratory streams. They live year-round in northern Mexico, in San Quintin, and other parts of the Baja Peninsula and other parts of northern Mexico, right? And so companies like Driscoll's, of course, has done all sorts of things to kind of create a workforce that is the kind of disciplined and reliable workforce that it needs for its production, right? Some of that entails some kind of ideological work, right? Instilling in these workers a sense of loyalty towards the company, right? And why is this necessary? Well, because it's very difficult to instill loyalty in agriculture. Why would that be? Anybody can say why is that? Why is it difficult to kind of like instill loyalty in the workforce in agriculture? Anybody? I want to hear from you guys. Why is that hard? Why is it a slam dunk to have your workers in those fields stay loyal to your company? Yes, Isaiah, you got it. Pesticides, devalued labor, easily replaceable, no health care. 100%, my man. The work sucks, right? It's absolutely terrible in terms of conditions, in terms of remuneration, in terms of possibilities for someone that we would call like upward mobility, right, or something like that. So workers are not loyal. It's not surprising why they're not loyal. The conditions basically suck, and that's across the board, right? There are differences depending on place and country and the industry, but agriculture is extremely tough, right? So, workers go from one company to another company if those companies offer, marginally better conditions, right? So there's no loyalty. So these companies like Driscoll's, have to do a kind of sort of ideological work, right? First of all. But the other thing that is actually very interesting is actually deploying technologies of labor control. And Slolinsky actually examines the use of new technologies to make sure that not only that workers produce at the levels that the company is expecting, but also technologies that take control away from the worker, right? So this is what we call sort of scientific management, right, of the labor process. Why, or to what purpose? Of course, to increase productivity, right? That's not surprising. So now, with all the technology that we have to sort of monitor movement and to track products, right? You put those strawberries in boxes, and those boxes have a barcode, and there are all sorts of measures, right, that have been implemented by companies like Driscoll to improve, not just to increase productivity, but also to control and to take away control of the work process from the workers, right, away from the work. The one thing in which I'm actually connected to all this stuff more sort of personally, is that these companies like Driscoll and other companies, are also using a visa, a temporary labor migration visa called the H-2A, in order to increase loyalty among the company, among the workers. And this is something I actually study. I study these as you know, I'm a migration scholar, and companies like Driscoll's, for example, give visas, these temporary visas, H-2A visas, to some of their best workers in Baja to come and work seasonally in California, in Arizona, perhaps in other places, right? Of course, when some of these workers come to the U.S., they're paid in dollars, they paid according to U.S. standards, even though standards in agriculture in the U.S. are also bad, but comparatively are better, right, than in Mexico. And so this is one way in which the company actually instills a sense of loyalty in the workers, but also discipline, because it gives these visas to their best workers, the ones that are most productive, that are better at doing what they're supposed to do. Remember that the production of berries, strawberries, and so on is extremely complicated, because this fruit gets damaged very easily, right? And the kinds of berries that we see in our supermarkets are perfect and beautiful, right? So, so these workers are brought seasonally with this visa, right, instilling loyalty among them. And then, of course, the company also benefits from their skills, their dexterity, right, and their experience when they are in U.S. facility, right? When the visa ends, those workers go back to Mexico, and they're given their Mexican jobs back only to the extent that they produce and behave and did not create any kind of trouble on the U.S. side. So this is actually a perfect system of labor control, transnational labor control. By the way, the H-2 visa is not meant to be for that purpose, but these companies are actually, in a way, manipulating or instrumentalizing, or whichever nice word you want to say or use, in order to create a kind of binational system of labor mobility, which is about transferring workers within the same company. Okay, we're moving very quickly towards the end of the class. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to ask you if you have any questions. We'll come back to some of these things. We have, I think, towards the end of the quarter, a week on environmental issues, agro-extractivism, et cetera, et cetera. For now, I want to ask you if you have any questions. Is there something that piques your curiosity, your interest, something that wasn't clear? Anything that might be missing, Andrew, on your part? There's something in the chat. That's a long one. My God. Who's that?
No, I'm sorry. I was gonna split it up. I was trying to split it up. So after the all caps Spemex, that's a question for the first half, and then the one struggle part about the tracking technology, that's about what you just talked about.
Yeah. You're addressing so many issues here, man. I don't know if we have the time, but it has these.
I know.
We have the Mexican economy. I mean, do they pay neoliberal? Big growth, supply chain. I mean, when you ask, has this helped the Mexican economy? In some ways, the answer to the question is yes, right? I mean, in the sense that, I mean, I guess what I want you to focus first and foremost, at least for now, is the kind of transformative effect. I mean, there is a huge, very significant transformation of the economy here, right? Has this benefited that larger population? Probably the answer to that is no, in the sense that, once again, Mexico still has very high levels of poverty. So some of these benefits have obviously not trickled down to the population, right? It has made some people very rich, obviously, but it doesn't. The impact has not benefited folks, right? The wages in this agricultural export sector are bad, right? And actually, just a few years ago, there was a big revolt, almost like an insurgency in the San Quintin Valley, because people were fed up with terrible conditions and low wages. Natalia? Was that Natalia?
Yeah. Just want to follow up on the response you just provided. Do you think the reason why, I mean, of course, I'm not taking away that there's still like poverty issues, but do you think it's because most of the investments are in the north side of Mexico for exporting, or do you think like the poverty level is mainly located in the south part of Mexico, since it's not really as close to the United States, so it's not as attractive to foreign investors?
So the jobs have not gone to the south, right? I mean, many of these jobs. So in that sense, I guess many of the benefits have not gone south, and the reason for that, has to do with partly with geography. These companies want to be close to the U.S. If they're exporting to the U.S., they want to be close to the U.S. The other thing is that there is a kind of something that sociologists and other social scientists call path dependence, meaning that if you have all these sort of clusters of know-how and industry and manufacturing located in one part of the country, other investments will go there. They're not going to go to where there is very little or no infrastructure, right, and know-how. So if you need engineers, you're going to go to the places where there are engineers or technicians or people with this sort of expertise. The places that are best connected to the markets that you're trying to get to. Okay, so in that sense, there is a kind of sort of path dependence in terms of why and how investments continue to go to northern Mexico, right? But guys, we're out of time. We'll continue with some of this stuff. I promise. Next question. Stay tuned, because I'm posting the readings. They're not there yet for next week, this afternoon, and hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll be able to see each other in person, which of course is I'm sure everybody's preference. Thank you, guys. Thank you for being here, and stay well.